Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us, whether it's morning as it is for Dave or evening as it is for many of us in China. Okay, we've got World War II on our minds as everyone gets ready for the big commemoration in Asia, which will be in early September. And I'm very honored that we're joined tonight by David Finkelstein. He is currently the Director for Asian Security Affairs at the Center for Naval Analysis in Arlington, Virginia. He's a career U.S. Army officer. He held various command and staff positions in field units. He's got more than 4 decades of experience in the military, academia, and the international think tank scene. And he graduated from West Point, received a PhD in Chinese and Japanese history from Princeton University, and studied Mandarin at Nankai University in Tianjin, China. And he's had a personal interest in the CBI theater, and he's got some fantastic images. So without wasting any further time, over to you, David.
Thanks, Melinda, and thanks everybody for being here. My Chinese name is Feng Dowei, and it's a great one for an old army officer. I was named after a warlord, the commander of the Red Army, and General Joseph Stilwell. Thanks, who was the commander of U.S. forces in China during World War II. So 84 years ago, the United States and China became allies in common cause against aggression. And for the first time in the history of the United States, Washington tied its own security to the fate of China. And for the first time in its history, China's survival as a sovereign nation depended upon assistance from abroad, especially from the United States. So as we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Allied victory, I think it's appropriate that we take some time to remember those years when our two countries were allies and to recall our historic cooperation. Now, it's impossible in just a half hour or 40 minutes to talk about everything on this subject. So what I admittedly offer to you this evening is an interpretive talk, which focuses on the American effort in the China-Burma-India theater, a story which many people may have forgotten with the passage of time. So, as we know, China was at war in Asia long before the other allied powers, beginning with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the Shanghai incident in 1932, and especially after the Marco Polo Bridge Lukochow incident in 1937. China fought bravely and alone for many years. And throughout most of the 1930s, there was little that the US could or would do to involve itself in the fighting in Asia, or Europe for that matter, for 3 reasons, which I'm sure you're all aware. First of all, the US economy was devastated by the Great Global Depression. In 1932, when Shanghai was under attack, nearly 20% of the population of the US was unemployed. Second, pacifism and isolationism were at a high point in 1930s America. Here's a picture of the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, who created the first America First movement, and telling Americans they should not be in this war. And third reason why the US couldn't do much was that the American Army in the 1930s was very small and not very modern. On the day of the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, the US Army had a total of 180,000 men. And here you can see in the Louisiana maneuvers of 1940, we're still using horse cavalry. So the US really had its hands tied. But Americans were horrified, frankly, at the brutality of the fighting in China. Attacks on innocent civilians were especially powerful in mobilizing American sentiment in favor of the government in Nanjing. So consequently, many Americans acted as private citizens to do what they could to support China. And of course, for example, Henry Luce, who grew up in China as the son of missionaries, used his media empire, which included at the time the very powerful Time and Life magazines, to keep reminding Americans that China was fighting for its life and needed Americans' help. And by the late 1930s, a series of charitable organizations were established across the United States to raise money to help the people of China. In 1940, most of these organizations combined to create the very successful umbrella group known as the United China Relief. And the United China Relief was very effective in propagandizing the travails and problems of China and bringing China's suffering to the average American. They raised millions of dollars for orphanages, for hospitals, and other projects. And their message was simple. One, China is fighting alone. Two, China is fighting the forces of aggression. And three, China needs America's help. So even before Pearl Harbor, there was a great amount of sympathy on the part of the American people for what the Chinese were going through. By 1940, the American government was now prepared to act in support of China, even before Pearl Harbor, as a result of four factors. One was the outbreak of war in Europe in 1939. Second, Japan joining the German-Italian fascist Axis in 1940. Third, lower left, the Japanese occupation of Indochina in 1940. And fourth, very significant, the signing of the Non-Aggression Pact between the Soviet Union and Japan in April 1941. This allowed Tokyo to move thousands of Japanese troops from Manchuria and Mongolia south into China. So before Pearl Harbor, and before the U.S. is at war, assistance took the form of two forms of assistance. One, financial aid, and two, military assistance. So between 1939 and 1941, the U.S., with the strong support of Treasury Secretary Morgenthau, pictured here, extended in 1940 dollars between 120 and 140 million dollars in loans and credits to the government in Chongqing. That doesn't sound a lot like a lot of money today, but during the Depression, that was a lot of money. So this was done in order to help stabilize China's currency, to purchase much needed supplies, and to bolster domestic confidence. But far and away, military aid was the most important aid that the U.S. provided China before Pearl Harbor. This became possible when the Lend-Lease Act was signed by the U.S. Congress and passed by the Congress and signed by the President in March 1941. The law authorized the President to transfer military equipment to any country deemed vital to the defense of the United States without immediate payment. And under this program, Great Britain, Russia, and now also China began to receive American military aid even before the U.S. was at war. Lend-Lease also allowed the training of foreign military personnel in the United States. So in October 1941, 2 months before Pearl Harbor, the first 50 Chinese military officers arrived at Army airfields in the U.S. To begin pilot training. It was Lend-Lease aid, significantly, to China that allowed the creation of the American Volunteer Group, the AVG, better known as the Flying Tigers. Once Lend-Lease was approved by Congress, the Chinese government was able to secure 100 Curtiss P-40 fighter aircraft pictured here for immediate transfer to China. But just as important as the planes, President Roosevelt permitted U.S. Army pilots to resign their commissions and volunteer to fight as contractors for the Chinese Air Force. This at a time when the U.S. Army was desperately short of pilots for its own small and underfunded Air Corps. So soon, about 90 American pilots and 180 ground crew personnel would be operating those 100 P-40 aircraft over the skies of Burma and China. And according to official U.S. Air Force histories of World War II, between the summer of 1941 and the summer of 1942, the year that the AVG was operating independently, the Flying Tigers established a remarkable combat record: 300 enemy aircraft destroyed at the cost of 50 aircraft and 9 pilots. So the Flying Tigers were officially disbanded as a unit of the Air Force in July 1942. So just recall, you hear a lot about the Flying Tigers in China. They operated for a little less than 12 months. In 1942, it was absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Corps, along with its commander, former Captain Claire Chennault, who was then made a 2-star general. When war finally did come to America at Pearl Harbor, China and the United States formally became allies, and thus was created what was known as the China-Burma-India Theater, CBI, to prosecute the war against Japan on the Asian mainland, a theater of war in which Chinese, American, and British Commonwealth soldiers would fight, live, and die together. And I would argue that on every level, the China theater was the most difficult of all theaters in World War II for the following reasons. First, logistically, China was cut off from all land and sea routes of supply after the Japanese closed the Burma Road in 1942. Air supply was the only option. More on this in a few minutes. Second, the Allied political leaders could not agree on priorities in this theater, and the military leaders could not agree on whether to emphasize land power or air power. President Roosevelt was in arguments all the time with Churchill and Stalin about what role China would play after World War II. As we know, what Roosevelt wanted China to be one of the so-called four policemen after the war. Stalin and Churchill were against this. And of course, domestically, politically, China had its own problems on its hands. As we know, the Second United Front ended with the new Fourth Army incident in 1941, the Second United Front between the nationalists and the communists, that is. And there was a puppet regime in Nanjing under Wang Jingwei, who's today is known as a traitor in both Taiwan and China. And Jiang Jieshi or Chiang Kai-shek did not have the complete support of even all of his army commanders. So you have the communists, you have the nationalists, and you have a puppet regime in Nanjing. So it's politically difficult, even domestically. And of course, at the operational level, Japan had about 800,000 troops in China with modern air and ground force equipment. And for its part, most of China's best units had been destroyed during the Shanghai-Nanjing campaign of 1937 and 1938. These were divisions, by the way, that were trained by the Germans in the 1930s. So for these reasons and others we can mention, the China-Burma-India theater really was a very challenging place to wage war. But there's another story. You know, in reviewing the alliance for this talk, I come to understand that if you only focus on the political problems, the so-called Barbara Tuchman narrative between high-level leaders, then you really miss another story, which I found quite fascinating as a former soldier and quite inspiring. You miss the story of U.S.-China military cooperation and mutual assistance at the operational and tactical level. You miss the story of just how huge this cooperative military effort was and how, in many respects, it really did achieve some successes. And you also miss out on the story of positive people-to-people relations of the alliance at a human level, and I'll close with that at the end of the talk. So let me talk first about the alliance and the air war. The U.S. air effort in China during the war was substantial. It started with the Flying Tigers before the war, but it grew steadily in size and capability between 1942 and 1945. The air mission included the following major organizations: the India-China wing of the Air Transport Command, the 10th Air Force, which was based in India, and the 14th Air Force, which was based in China. By early 1944, there were almost 50,000 U.S. Army Air Force personnel associated with the air mission in China. And I want to touch on the role of, Alan, this is for you. I want to touch on the role of the U.S. Army Air Transport Command for a little bit, because its India-China wing was so vital to the war effort. The Air Transport Command was responsible for the critical and dangerous mission of flying supplies and personnel back and forth between China and India across the Himalaya mountains known as the Hump. This was the first time in history that a government isolated from the rest of the world by land and sea was supported and supplied nearly exclusively by a strategic airlift. The U.S. Air Force's official history notes that until the Burma Road was reopened in January 1945, and let me quote this because it's great: every vehicle, every gallon of fuel, every weapon, every round of ammunition, every typewriter, and every ream of paper which found its way to free China during the war was flown in by air from India. And this strategic airlift campaign to keep China fighting was extremely dangerous for several reasons. First, the aircraft were relatively small by today's standards. The maximum load of a C-46 transport was between 20 and 40 tons based on conditions. However, in a desperate and relentless effort to increase the tonnage flown to China, the aircraft was often dangerously overloaded, leading to a lot of crashes over the hump. A second reason was that the route itself was very treacherous. Flying over the Himalayan mountains meant flying over peaks over 3,000 meters or 5,000 meters high in bad weather without radio beacons, with no weather intelligence from the Chinese end, with iced over wings and little radio contact with the airfields in China. So this is a tough route to be flying. And third was the possibility of Japanese fighter plane attacks. Initially, these cargo planes did not have fighter escorts. And the fourth reason this was a difficult mission was the pilots. Now, look at the good luck, good work. You made it again. Talk about gallows humor, which is typical of the military. The American pilots who flew these missions were in their early 20s. They were extremely inexperienced, and we lost many of them, over 1,000 confirmed or killed or missing. Uh, Let me read an excerpt from a report to Washington in 1943 by a U.S. Army Air Corps general in India commenting on this. We are paying for supplies to China in men and airplanes. The kids we have here flying are flying over their heads. We're asking boys to do what would be the most difficult for men to accomplish. With no experience, here we're going to pay dearly for tonnage moved across the hump. We're going to pay with men, and there's nothing else that we can do about it. And just to give you a sense for how this tonnage increased, in the first year of the war in 1942, a total of 85 tons of supplies are flown to China. But by July 1945, as the war is ending, 71,000 tons of every month are going to China. So this is quite amazing. My Air Force history says that at the end of the war, almost 700,000 tons of supplies were airlifted to China at a cost of 600 aircraft and 1,400 crew and passengers. Now, Chinese help was really essential to the air effort. First, in the absence of heavy machinery, human labor was needed to create the airfields in China that could support cargo planes and later on the heavy B-29 bombers. I throw up this self-aggrandizing picture. I actually made it to one of the last U.S. Army air bases in China out in Chengdu. So it took a lot of labor. You have Chinese peasants who are pushing stone rollers to crush gravel to make an air landing strip. And second, the air bases were rudimentary at best. So you had a lot of air refueling by hand, which was the only way to do this. There was no machinery at these air bases. And this is very dangerous for any of you who've spent any time around aircraft and very, very flammable materials. You see, they have a chain of buckets that they're using to pour bucket by bucket into the fuel tank of a Chinese bomber. And finally, and this one's for Melinda, Chinese citizens were vital to locating down aircraft and recovering U.S. pilots. These hundreds of acts of bravery by local Chinese people are exemplified by the help given to the Doolittle Raiders after the 1942 attack on Tokyo. So we should think of this air effort in China as a combined American and Chinese effort. And I would add that even today, the remains of U.S. aircraft and U.S. pilots who crashed in China during World War II are still being found and recovered by the U.S. Department of Defense with the cooperation of the Ministry of National Defense in Beijing. Before moving on to the ground war, there was one small discovery I made in my research that I found fascinating. You may recall I mentioned that beginning in late 1940, Chinese Air Force pilots were being trained in the United States. They must have been making some really excellent progress because in late 1943, a unit known as the 14th U.S. Air Force Chinese-American Composite Air Wing was created. And here is the patch of that unit. It is a fully integrated air wing of Chinese and American pilots. And of course, you see the Chinese pilots are calling themselves the Fei Long Flying Dragons and Fei Hu for the Americans. A lot of these pilots were quick to heap praise on each other. So, for example, in CBI's official newspaper, the American wing commander, a gentleman pictured here by the name of Morse, had this to say about his Chinese pilots, quote, "We think the Chinese pilots are so good that we're staking our lives on them. Personally, I'd go and fight anywhere with these Chinese pilots." That's pretty high praise from a grizzled old American Air Corps fighter pilot. And for their part, the Chinese had this to say about working with their American counterparts. This is from the gentleman pictured here, Major C.H. Yuan. Quote, "We work together like two fingers on the same hand. We have to, for we are fighting the same battles in the same planes, and to help our brothers means helping ourselves." So I think this photo really tells it all. This is a photo of some of the folks in this composite wing. So here you see Americans and Chinese integrated into the same unit. In today's military parlance, we would call this a combined unit, a unit made up of one more than one country. So really an interesting chapter in the history of the American Air Force. Uh, Let me now turn a little bit to the ground war, uh, and because it was critical. The mission of the U.S. was to train, retrain, and re-equip the Chinese ground forces. And prior to my research, I really didn't have an adequate appreciation for how large or successful this training effort actually was. From 1942 until the end of World War II in 1945, American Army personnel took on the task of equipping and training multiple divisions, over 30 divisions of a Chinese army that had three missions. One, take back Burma from the Japanese. Two, defeat the enemy in China proper. And three, support a future envisioned Allied invasion of Japan, which many people thought was going to take place from China. And it was the unmistakable and unshakable belief of General Joseph Stilwell, pictured here, that the Chinese soldier, once equipped, trained, led, fed, and paid, would prove as capable a soldier as any and would be capable of defeating the Imperial Japanese Army. And frankly, Stilwell was proven correct when the American-trained Chinese Army units went on the offensive in the jungles and mountains of western Yunnan and northern Burma in 1944. Now, this training effort took place in three areas. First was in India, in Ramgarh. This was established in the spring of 1942. Second, in Kunming, established in April 1943. And third, for a short period of time in Guilin in Guangxi province before Guilin was overrun by the Japanese during Tokyo's 1944 Ichigo offensive. Now, so this is a pretty big training operation that's going on. So they're training in the theater in which they are fighting a war at the same time. So on one hand, they've got to fight the Japanese. At the same time, they're training. So the Chinese forces that were trained in Ramgarh, India, initially consisted of those Chinese divisions that escaped to India after the British were run out of Burma in 1942. And for those who keep track of the units, this included from the Nationalist Army, the 38th, 22nd, and 20th Chinese divisions, originally known and designated as the X-Force. And also trained at Ramgarh were thousands of Chinese soldiers who were flown from China over the Hump to India by the Air Corps to serve as replacements for those divisions, and who also filled the ranks of the newly created Chinese New First Army that was being set up in India, known as the Xinyi in Chinese. So collectively, these Ramgarh India-trained Chinese units and their associated support elements became known as the Chinese Army in India, and something that I didn't realize before I got into the National Archives. Close to 150,000 Chinese troops were trained at Ramgarh during the course of the war. Now, Kunming was the location of a second major training center under a U.S. organization now long forgotten called the Chinese Training and Combat Command. At Kunming, Chinese soldiers known as the Y Force, Y for Yunnan, were trained by the U.S. Army. Initially, this consisted of 27 Chinese divisions that were deployed defensively near Kunming, Chongqing, and on the Indo-Chinese border. These units eventually became the nucleus of the Chinese Expeditionary Force, in Chinese, Yuan Zhongjun, under General Wei Li Huang that would help to retake northern Burma in 1944. Also trained and equipped at Kunming was a 36 Division Chinese force known as the Alpha Force that countered the Japanese offensives in 1944. By the way, the General McClure happens to be the grandfather of one of my West Point classmates, and I had a chance to speak to my classmate, his grandson, and hear more about his grandfather's exploits during the war. Over the course of the war, hundreds of American officers and enlisted men served as military instructors and support troops to help make the Chinese Army more combat effective. The U.S. Army carefully chose the officers and soldiers who would provide the training. Many were career soldiers who were themselves graduates of U.S. military schools, but mostly they were combat veterans from other theaters of war, such as North Africa and Italy. Uh, so they took the combat experience they had against the Germans, they brought it to either China or India and helped the Chinese get the benefit of those lessons. And just to be clear, at these training centers, the Americans did not command Chinese troops. Chinese commanded Chinese troops, and the Americans were there to serve as trainers and advisors. There was a lot of sensitivity to sovereignty issues, as you could well imagine. And it was not just Chinese who were trained at these locations. General Stilwell was convinced, or actually insisted, that any American officer or enlisted person who was involved in training the Chinese had to take Chinese lessons. So here you have a really rare photo. What's rare about this photo, actually, is that there are two African American officers in this class in the middle there at a time when the U.S. Army was segregated. There's a lot that could be said about how working in the China-Burma-India theater broke down all sorts of segregationist barriers, but that's another story for another discussion. But over the course of the war, hundreds of these Americans helped support and train the Chinese army to be more combat effective. And again, just to be clear, here we have the class of trainers at the training center at the artillery school. Artillery being one of the biggest areas where the Chinese army needed some assistance. They had enough experience with infantry, they just needed better tactics and equipment. But artillery, which has a bunch of science attached to it, was something that they needed help with. And they also needed help with specialized training. So here you have a picture of an American combat engineer showing Chinese soldiers how to use plastic explosives, which was critical for taking out Japanese bunkers once they got into the complexes of northern Burma. And also at Ramgarh, for the first time, a modern Chinese tank force was created. 7 tank battalions. That's about 200 tanks or more. These light tank units would be needed for the Burma offensive. Light tanks such as the American Stuart tanks depicted here. They did really well. If you read the records of the tank battalions that were created, the Chinese were quick learners. They had a little problem with maintenance at first, but as far as employing these tanks in battle, they really learned their lessons well. And of course, here is a picture of combat support. You have a communications unit. Here you have an American Signal Corps unit that's teaching the Chinese how to put in tactical communication systems, tactical telephone systems for offensives. So, one can only wonder what it must have been like to see the result of American and Chinese culture coming together under such difficult circumstances. I mean, after all, these were not college students on a summer exchange program like you have today. I imagine that this must have been very strange an experience, at times bewildering, occasionally funny, and sometimes frustrating for both the Chinese and the Americans. But you do read a lot of stories if you get into the archives about how these young Chinese and American men and women, far away from home and their families for the first time, learned to live with each other, learned to learn from each other, and how they created their own combined way of life. And again, in the archives, there was a great letter from a Chinese sergeant by the name of Cho Feng, who was trained at Ramgarh. Let me read a letter from him. Quote, There were female American soldiers at Ramgar. Whenever we saw them, we would act like the Americans. We would whistle and give them a thumbs up and say loudly to them, "So beautiful." They would turn their heads and smile broadly at us and reply, "Ni hao, da jia hao." The language barrier, he continues, never stopped us from showing friendliness to each other in various ways. For over a year in Ramgar, we had been speaking in a strange new language, mixed with half Chinese and half English. It was an interesting time of life. So this is a great photo. I love the nurse who's got her doll, her army nurses. She's taking her doll off the transport plane. She's being greeted by her Chinese counterparts, and pretty soon these young nurses would be deployed in the lines with Chinese units helping the wounded. I'll show you some pictures of that later. Uh, so At Kunming, not all of the Chinese army units in the Y Force could come to the training center at one time because they were actually in defensive positions fighting the Japanese. So General Stilwell comes up with this concept of mobile training teams. So instead of the troops coming to a training center, he would send American Army trainers to the front lines and train Chinese units where they were deployed. So here you see a mobile communications training team providing instruction to a Chinese unit somewhere in Yunnan. And something that I found particularly fascinating, among my other ignominious time and activities in the Army, I'm a graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. The U.S. Army recreated the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, in China. And it was called the Kunming Command and General Staff School. And it was there for senior Chinese officers. So it's fascinating. This is the first time that the U.S. Army takes one of its schools and recreates it overseas. And the fundamental mission of this school was to teach U.S. Army warfighting doctrine to senior Chinese Army officers, and as well as the lessons learned by the U.S. Army in combat in other theaters of war. So I don't know, Melinda, if these buildings still exist in Kunming. Maybe you can sniff around sometime and find out. But the first class of 73 Chinese officers reported on the 15th of May, 1944 for the 8-week course. And they represented 36 different units of the Chinese Army, consisted of 13 generals, 11 colonels, 15 lieutenant colonels, and 34 majors. And so in the first year of operation, they graduated about 300 students. At the end of the war, they would have trained over 2,000. Again, drawing on the National Archives research I did, I found a letter in the archives from a Chinese officer who attended this school and wrote back to the commandant. And let me quote. His name is Colonel Xie Zhongyi of the Chinese First Group Army. Let me read the letter. Dear Colonel Martin, the instruction that I received from you while at the Command and General Staff School has proven of great benefit. I am now applying what valuable knowledge I acquired from you to practical work. In so doing, I hope to perform my part in the cause of defeating Japan and winning final victory. The staff of the Field Army to which I am assigned has been reorganized in accordance with the staff procedures of the United States Army. We now have a G1 personnel, G2 intelligence, G3 operations, and G4 logistics. I think you will be delighted in hearing that I have put into actual use that which you have taught us. With all best wishes, Colonel Xia. Love that letter. Of course, I really came away with a deeper appreciation for the huge scale and complexity and effectiveness of the military training enterprises at Ramgar, Kunming, and Guilin. From nothing, the US and China created some of the largest military training sites in the world outside the United States, all while engaged at the same time of fighting the very war they were training to win. So it's quite an amazing story. And so if you ask, how effective was this training? Well, the official US military histories assess that Chinese units trained by the US did very well when sent back into Burma. And in doing some research, I found that there are mainland Chinese professors or historians who believe the same thing. I won't bore you with the details, but there's a Professor Zhang Baijia, who is at the History Research Center of the CCP Central Committee, who in 2011 wrote that The Chinese elements that received American-style training were visibly at a higher level, and their equipment was also improved. They did much better than even our own forces. And there's also a professor, Zhang Yunhu at Beida, who previously served in the military history department of the PLA's Academy of Military Science, and he wrote, quote, "The Americans introduced U.S. Army training methods and priorities with great effectiveness, and Professor Zhang credits the Chinese victories in Burma in part to the training that the Chinese forces received from the Americans." So even from the CCP side, there is a, if not grudging, but there is a recognition that these were very effective training operations that helped the Chinese nationalists do very, very well operationally during the taking of Burma. And a last thing I'll just talk about, and I found this equally fascinating because this actually has echoes of Vietnam 30 years later. Uh, the U.S. Army did not just train and equip the Chinese forces and then send them off with gay and reckless abandon to fight. American military personnel went with Chinese forces into combat, and the U.S. Army created an extensive program of American military advisors who were organized into liaison teams. And these liaison teams were embedded with Chinese units that deployed into combat. These teams proved very effective in providing advice to their Chinese counterpart commanders during the Western Yunnan, Northern Burma campaign, and later on during the campaigns against Japan in central China. This is a photo here of General Boatner, one-star General Boatner, who was responsible for these training teams. And here are the instructions he gave to these liaison teams. Quote, "Your duty is to make the Chinese unit to which you are assigned the most combat effective unit possible." End quote. Pretty clear mission. So this concept matured to the point that by 1945, all 36 Chinese combat divisions in the Kunming Alpha Force had American military liaison teams comprising some 3,500 or so U.S. military personnel going into combat with their assigned Chinese units. And equally important, these Chinese divisions had American combat support units attached to them. And here we have in the next couple of slides showing a U.S. Army medical detachment. And there is one of those nurses now. She's not looking as pert as she was coming off that plane. Here they are in the front lines in Burma treating Chinese wounded. All of these photos, by the way, come from the National Archives in the United States. And of course, here is a photo of a U.S. Army Signal Corps team that was attached to a Chinese combat unit. It was critical for these people who had technical skills that the Chinese didn't have time to learn to provide the vital command and control capabilities that allow coordination. So as we close up here, needless to say, some strong bonds of friendship between American and Chinese soldiers were formed through combat as they lived together and also as they died together. This photo is of the burial of a U.S. liaison officer who was killed in action while advising his Chinese unit. And this photo shows American liaison personnel paying their respects at the memorial for a Chinese Army colleague who was killed in action from their unit. And of course, there were tremendous acts of bravery by all concerned, British Commonwealth, Americans, and Chinese. But I find this really interesting. Here is the deputy commander of the China-Burma India Theater, General Dan Sultan, presenting the Silver Star Medal, which is right below the Congressional Medal of Honor, to a Chinese officer for bravery and valor in combat during the Burma campaign. And a place I've never been before, the Guoshang Military Cemetery near the city of Tongchung in Yunnan. There were the remains of over 3,000 Chinese soldiers who died taking that city from the Imperial Japanese Army in 1944. And the gentleman pictured there is retired Colonel John Easterbrook. He is the grandson of General Stilwell. And Colonel Easterbrook, who I know from the Army, visited Tongchung and told me, this is his photo, told me that the cemetery has memorial stones to the 19 American Army liaison team members who died advising their Chinese units in the campaign to take the walled city of Tongchung. It's a place I'd like to visit someday. I haven't said anything about the Chinese communists and the Red Army to this point, and that is because Chiang Kai-shek would not allow the Americans to have contact with the communists who were holed up in Yan'an at the time. But by 1944, there were compelling reasons why the U.S. went ahead and pressured Chiang to permit U.S. military contact with Yan'an. First, the last direct contact between the Chinese Communist Red Army and the U.S. military, believe it or not, was in 1938, when Captain Evans Carlson, pictured here, of the U.S. Marine Corps, traveled with the 8th Route Army for almost a year and had extensive conversations with Mao Zedong. The American military and the China-Burma-India theater now wondered what the prospects were for cooperation with the Red Army if an offensive against Japan and China was to be mounted. And secondly, the U.S. was now deploying B-29 bombers, long-range bombers, to the China-Burma-India theater. And they required weather intelligence, and they wanted to know if the communists could provide assistance in recovering downed air crews should they crash. So, of course, the U.S. military was also hungry for intelligence about the Japanese forces in northern China and Manchuria, where the Red Army was operating. So this was in preparation for the final future assault against Japan, which I mentioned earlier, many believed would be launched from China. So therefore, in 1944, a small organization of about 25 Americans, known informally as the Dixie Mission for the rebels, but officially known as the U.S. Army Observer Group, went to Yan'an and met with Mao. And here you see Colonel David Barrett, a veteran China hand who was in charge of that mission, flanked by Zhu De, the commander of the Red Army, on one side, and Mao Zedong on the other. So there was a lot of practical work to be done together there. For example, this included combined U.S. and Chinese salvage and rescue operations for downed air crews. These are Red Army guerrillas with an American in his Chinese style uniform working with the Red Army to locate downed flyers. There was the issue of joint interrogation of Japanese military prisoners held by the Chinese communists, and also help to expand the airfield at Yan'an to be able to accept larger planes. And also of note, I really like this picture. The gentleman with the white-collared shirt is the American-born, American-Lebanese communist George Hatem, known as Ma Haida in Chinese, who was the medical advisor to the Red Army. He was on the Long March, and after liberation in 1949, as they say, he became the first Minister of Health in the People's Republic of China. But here he is with a U.S. Army medical doctor, and this medical team is there to help improve the medical facilities for the Red Army. Now, the American military mission to Yan'an with the CCP remained in Yan'an until March 1947, until the Marshall Mission broke down, the mission that General Marshall was sent to try to broker a peace between the communists and the nationalists after the war ended. And its last mission was to ensure the safe passage of Mao Zedong from Chongqing back to Yan'an. And here you can't see his face, but in the back, you see that Homburg hat. That's Ambassador Patrick Hurley, at the time ambassador to China. There's Mao Zedong with a pith helmet and Zhu De in the front, commander of the Red Army, and they're being taken back to Yan'an with safe passage. It would be 33 years until 1980, when the U.S. Army and the People's Liberation Army had contact once again. So to finish up, the war in Asia ended abruptly, as we know, with the dropping of the atomic bombs. Within a month, the unconditional surrender of Japan took place, first on September 2nd aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri, pictured here, and again on September 9th in Nanjing, when General He Ing-chin of the Nationalists accepted the surrender of the commander of all forces of Japan. And of course, now with the war ending so abruptly, an invasion of China, an invasion of Japan, I'm sorry, an invasion of Japan from China would be unnecessary. The US occupation of Japan began almost immediately. So American forces were brought into China to help accept the surrender of thousands of Japanese forces. And here is a picture of the American Army coming into my adopted Laojia, Tianjin, in 1945. And almost overnight, the China-Burma-India theater began to close down, and thousands of Americans are being shipped to other theaters of war or back home. So strategically, the war in China actually ended in Japan's surrender. But at the operational level, it was a stalemate. The Japanese were able to invade and occupy large parts of China, but they could never conquer China due to the heroic efforts of the Red Army, the Nationalist Army, the Americans, and the British Commonwealth troops. The Chinese and the Allies, for their part, were able to retake Burma and open the land route to China. And they kept the Japanese Imperial Japanese Army from taking the rest of China. But the Allies never had the chance to decisively defeat the Japanese army in a ground offensive in occupied China because the war ended so quickly. And so, in conclusion, I've tried to really go quickly to recall and remember the really remarkable combined US-China efforts to train, equip, and advise the Chinese military to keep China in the fight. It was a massive, unprecedented effort that is largely untold. There's more to this theater than the Flying Tigers and the Doolittle raid. But just like in Europe and North Africa and South Pacific, G.I. Joe went to war in China. And on some, it made a lasting and lifelong impression. Over the course of the war, between 200,000 and 300,000 US military personnel served in the China-Burma-India theater. Many had a chance to learn about China, its culture, and its people. And this is a photograph of Private First Class Frederick W. Moat, who in 1940 was a Chinese language student at Columbia University and finds himself in the army in China during World War II. He stayed in China after the war. He married a Chinese woman. He received a PhD in Chinese history from Nanjing University, and in 1949 was detained and ejected from China by the communists. He was also my professor of Chinese history at Princeton University, and he is the founder of Ming Studies, Ming Dynasty Studies in the United States. And he had some remarkable stories to share with me when he was still alive. And so finally, I think the story of our alliance surely shows that despite our many differences, on a person-to-person level, Chinese and Americans can in fact live and work together under difficult situations. And I think the American soldiers I've spoken to who served in China before they passed on, really never forgot the Chinese who helped them. And I also hope that the Chinese will never forget the Americans who came to China to help them in their hour of great need.
The kudos are already pouring in. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dave.
See
Fantastic
you out in
talk.
Beijing, I hope.